Welcome back. Cold War Oversimplified Part 2. If you haven't checked out Part 1, go check it out. I'll put a title card in the top right here. Hopefully I'll remember to do that. So where we left off is JFK is now president. It is 1960. The Bay of Pigs invasion is going to be happening next year. Nikita Khrushchev is now the first secretary of the Communist Party of the United Socialists or Soviet Socialist Republic, otherwise known as the USSR. And the Cold War is really starting to heat up. Don't have really much anything else to say. Thank you all very much for the comments, likes, subscriptions, everything. If you wouldn't mind leaving a subscription, I would really appreciate that because it actually helps out the channel quite a lot. So without further ado, let's get into the Cold War Oversimplified Part 2.
By Skillshare, an online learning community where you can learn just about anything. Support my channel by signing up using the link below and get your first 2 months for free. For anyone who thinks recent US history has never been as crazy as it is right now, allow me to present to you the 1960s, extreme cultural division, major political assassinations, and the closest the world has ever come to nuclear apocalypse. Shocked by the CIA's intrusive methods for putting down socialism in Latin America, a certain Fidel Castro met with a certain Che Guevara in a bar in Mexico City, and the two of them decided they should grow some awesome beards and overthrow the Cuban government, which is exactly what they did. Cuba had been America's summer playground, and America didn't like seeing a communist regime being set up in its own backyard. So the US immediately began training up Cuban exiles to invade Cuba and overthrow Castro. However, as the day of the operation came closer, Kennedy wanted to conceal any US involvement in the plan, so he massively scaled back American air support, and as a result, the Bay of Pigs invasion was a humiliating defeat for America. But
yeah, and not only that too, this was a humiliating defeat for Kennedy. So when this took place, and I want to say April 1961, Kennedy is obviously only a year into his first term. He doesn't have the best start. It's quite rocky, especially judging by today's standards. And this was a huge embarrassment for him. The Bay of Pigs invasion sort of started with Eisenhower. I believe he approved the funding for it, and he had the initial planning phase. And JFK eventually executed the plan, though, as Oversimplified just noted, he scaled back the air involvement, which really was a bad idea because if there's a random force that's invading Cuba and the United States is very hostile to Cuba, it's quite obvious that the United States is involved. So the Bay of Pigs was an absolute disaster for Kennedy and was really quite poorly planned out.
Castro felt there was still an impending US threat to his regime. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, Khrushchev had a lot of medium-range nuclear missiles that couldn't reach America, but they could if they were positioned, say, on an exotic Caribbean island off the coast of Florida. Hey, I'm a communist who hates America. You're a communist who hates America. You know what that means? We should fall in love. I was just gonna suggest you set your missiles up in Cuba. Oh, no, you're right. That's a better idea. Be still, my beating heart. On October 14th, 1962, a U-2 spy plane over Cuba noticed something strange. Sir, you need to look at this photograph. You're right! That's the cutest dog I've ever seen! Sir, I was referring more to the Soviet missiles. America...
And if you've ever seen these photographs too, they're kind of cool that you can just sort of see the basic shapes of them. Obviously, these spy planes are not the most sophisticated technology, compared to what we have now with, photos taken from space for all intents and purposes. But yeah, they're kind of cool. You can find these photos online and go check them out if you're interested.
Freaked out as they realized what was going on. They were completely vulnerable and they had to act fast. They knew that airstrikes or an invasion of Cuba would likely mean nuclear war with the Soviet Union. So Kennedy came up with another idea, a blockade. The US Navy announced it would stop and search any Soviet ships heading to Cuba and would sink any that did
really
not
ramping
comply.
up the tension
response,
here.
The Soviet put its military into full combat readiness. The US did the same and began drawing up plans for an attack on Cuba. Things were escalating fast, and both superpowers were getting ready for World War III. Emergency communications between the two sides broke down as Khrushchev rejected Kennedy's demands for the missiles to be removed. And for the first time in history, US Strategic Air Command moved to DEFCON 2. DEFCON 1 means nuclear war. The Soviets shot down a U-2 spy plane over Cuba. A Soviet nuclear submarine in the Caribbean mistakenly believed war had already broken out, and two of the senior officers gave the go-ahead to fire its nuclear torpedo. Thankfully, the third senior officer, this beautiful man, refused to authorize the decision. The US...
Yeah, and Vasily Arkhipov really, sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong, really should be more known in history. He really was the last one that sort of defied orders in a manner or brought about an opposite opinion. And they actually had a secret weapon on board, which was a nuclear weapon that would have been able to launch from the submarine. I'm not sure exactly which type of missile it was, unfortunately. But he actually went against the advice of the other two. I believe he was the first mate, I want to say, or at least what the American term would be, the first mate. And he decided to surface and await orders from Moscow. And that, I mean, this man pretty much single-handedly stopped inevitable nuclear war between the United States and the USSR. And it's a shame that more people don't know about him. And he was able to continue his naval career and sort of died, not really in obscurity, I want to say, but he just sort of lived out a normal life in Russia. And he was able to see the fall of the Soviet Union. I believe he died in 1999, maybe 98 or something. Really, really an interesting person. I read a lot about him when I was younger because I was just so fascinated with him. So,
refused to authorize the decision. The U.S. finalized its preparations, and I kid you not, the day before the U.S. were set to decide the day and time for the Cuban invasion, Khrushchev was like, "Hey, you know if you just removed your missiles from Turkey, we'd remove ours from Cuba?" Yeah, that sounds good to me. It was a bit more complicated than that, but at the last second, the two sides finally came to an agreement. Soviet missiles were shipped out of Cuba, and the world breathed one gigantic sigh of relief, except for one guy, who was bloody livid. Phew! Let's hope that's the biggest crisis of my presidency. Unfortunately for him, his presidency was to end with one. Having nearly blown up the planet, a few changes were made. First, the superpowers agreed to a limited test ban treaty. Secondly, the Soviets ousted Khrushchev and replaced him with Leonid Brezhnev, who was a kisser. He liked.
So this is the fraternal socialist kiss, which is supposed to be, I think it's 3 kisses on the cheek, I want to say. And this was a greeting done by socialist leaders to sort of show fraternity. It's also done by Gaullists as well, and obviously everyone knows this typical greeting. But this is a piece of art that's on the Berlin Wall that you can still go see today. I believe it's called "My God, Can We Stop This Love?" or something along these lines. It's those, probably the most famous painting on the Berlin Wall. And this is a real photograph actually between Erich Honecker and Leo Brezhnev. Honecker being the leader, arguably dictator, of East Germany for quite a long time until the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I've actually seen this in real life. It was restored, I believe, a couple years ago because it was fading and people had put graffiti over it. But now there's a little barrier, so people don't deface it. But if you're ever in Berlin, go check it out.
A kiss. Both sides were deeply concerned at the prospect of nuclear war, but still, the arms race raged on throughout the 60s and 70s. US intelligence worked out that the Soviets' nuclear arsenal was not as powerful as they previously thought, but in fact, it was America that held the advantage. ABMs and MIRVs were developed, and the doctrine of MAD. If both sides knew they would be completely destroyed by a nuclear war, neither would risk starting one.
And this was sort of, and I alluded this in the last video, but this was really sort of the beginning of the modern understanding of warfare that we have, where superpowers do not directly attack themselves. A superpower will either attack a smaller nation to which the other superpower will proxy fund it. And this is sort of what we saw in the 20th century post the development of nuclear weapons and the MAD doctrine, the mutually assured destruction.
But even without war, the world was already feeling the effects of nuclear weapons. In 1966, above the pleasant town of Palomares in Spain, a US bomber collided with a tanker mid-air, and 4 hydrogen bombs fell and landed near the town below. It hasn't exploded, so I'm sure everything's fine. Whoa, boy.
Wow.
Hey, I wouldn't eat that if I were you. Okay. What were you gonna do today? Go for a swim? Yeah, I wouldn't. Are you breathing right now? Yeah, I wouldn't. It took the Americans
I did not know that.
2.5 months to find one of the bombs, which had gone missing in the ocean. This was the 14th time America had lost a nuclear bomb since 1950.
Really?
Nobody knows how many bombs the Soviet Union lost. So sleep well tonight.
Didn't know that.
After Kennedy's assassination, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson took over, and he inherited a developing crisis in the East. Vietnam.
Yes.
Back in the 50s, the Vietnamese had kicked their French colonizers out once and for all, and the country was divided into 2. In the north, a common...
Yep, and the how they kicked them out, there's a famous battle called the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, where they were actually... One of the big terrors that the French had over the North Vietnamese or at least just the Vietnamese at this point because it was not the North Vietnamese, apologies, was they had air power. And at Dien Bien Phu, a helicopter was actually shot down by a Vietnamese soldier. And there's actually still, I believe there is still stamps that you can buy of this sort of victory to this day, the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. I think that was in 1954, if I want to say correctly.
Communist regime, and in the south, an anti-communist regime. Both were led by very sweet-looking old men, but don't let that deceive you. They were both ruthless dictators, and both dreamed of reuniting Vietnam under their own regime.
Yeah, and the corruption of... There's a fantastic documentary by Ken Burns called The Vietnam War. It's about 18 hours long, and it's probably the best piece of media I've ever seen in my life. It goes into an exorbitant amount of details into the South Vietnamese leadership, the North Vietnamese leadership. There's interviews with American soldiers, South Vietnamese soldiers, North Vietnamese soldiers. And it's just an all-encompassing history. And the amount of corruption that was going on with the South Vietnamese government, the American government, just so many of the steps that were taken that were clearly wrong. They knew it was wrong, but they continued anyways to save face. Henry Kissinger, Robert McNamara, he knew that the war was lost. He knew that their doctrine of attrition, which is to say you can just kill more people than they're able to supply, was incorrect. And he knew that the war was lost. And he knew this by 1966. And he didn't do anything. And the war continued until Richard Nixon. So I'd highly recommend go check that out. I could talk probably for the next hour about the Vietnam War, but I'll leave it at that.
So the North established the National Liberation Front, also known as the Viet Cong, to carry out a campaign of guerrilla warfare in the South with Soviet support. The US sent advisors to help train the South Vietnamese to deal with the threat, but President Diem's brutal policies pushed more and more South Vietnamese to support the Viet Cong.
And even then, President Diem, he was not the first president of South Vietnam. He was actually... he was not the first, but there was a long string of South Vietnamese leaders that were assassinated, and the U.S. supported some of them and didn't support some of them, but it was just a constant realm of chaos in the South Vietnamese government. It's all in that documentary. I'd highly recommend checking it out.
Over the next decade, the situation escalated to a breaking point. America feared the domino effect. That is, if South Vietnam fell to communism, would Cambodia be next? Then Laos? Thailand?
Yes,
Burma? India?
Not quite.
LBJ had to make a choice between losing South Vietnam or sending in the troops. And so in they went. From 1965, America found itself in a war unlike anything it had ever fought before.
True.
Let's play Spot the Viet Cong Soldier.
You can't.
Did you see him? Of course not. That's because millions of young American men were drafted and sent to fight a ruthless enemy who used the thick jungle as its shield. It was nearly impossible to tell where the enemy was, or worse, who it was. And as a result, the civilian population got caught up in the brutal crossfire. The city of Saigon found itself...
Yeah, and there was, again, go check out the documentary, but there was the massacre of My Lai, and they actually interviewed a soldier who went to My Lai afterwards, and just the amount of civilian casualties is just... It's unreal how many Vietnamese people died in this, albeit civil war. Not to mention Agent Orange, the effects of Agent Orange that are still being felt to this day. The amount of explosives that was dropped over Vietnam is more than any other place in human history. And to this day, there are still many unexploded ordnance that kill people every year in Vietnam.
Under regular attack, and America launched a bombing campaign in the north during Operation Rolling Thunder.
Again, the most explosives ever put on a piece of land ever.
The Viet Cong used the Ho Chi Minh Trail running through Laos and Cambodia to supply the campaign. It was a long and brutal war.
Which Nixon actually went and started bombing Laos and Cambodia secretly to try and destroy the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which he was ultimately unsuccessful in.
And I could never do it justice in this video, but in terms of the Cold War, Vietnam was probably the biggest of many, many global conflicts that that signaled a turning point. Under the threat of nuclear war, the two superpowers began working to make their relationship more constructive, and as a result, their ideological battle shifted away from the potential of direct conflict and more towards attempting to influence smaller proxy wars around the world. In the Middle East, the Soviet Union provided aid against Israel during the Six-Day War, and then again when the US backed Israel during the Yom Kippur War. In Africa, the Angolan Civil War saw US-supported South Africans fighting Soviet-supported Cubans. In the conflict between Somalia and Ethiopia, the superpowers interestingly switched sides as regimes changed, and the US continued fighting the spread of communism in its own backyard, funding the famous Contra groups to fight the socialist junta in Nicaragua. These proxy wars were fierce enough to begin with, but superpower intervention amplified the destruction and created alarming levels of human suffering.
I mean, wow. You just look at this list and you go, for what? Right? All for what? And I can't even imagine what the death toll of all these wars continues to be. It's really a shame when you look at this list, and this probably isn't even the whole list, and this is just what took place between 1955 and up to 1992. 1999 it looks like. So that's just a shame, really a shame.
Throughout the Third World, and in Vietnam, that human suffering was all being broadcast back home via good old television. Going into the late 60s,
which was something that had never been really done before. So obviously they had broadcasters in Korea, they had broadcasters in World War II. However, the footage that was shown to Americans in the Vietnam War wasn't as heavily censored as it was in World War II. The technology was different. The advent of sort of not just handheld cameras, but more accessible cameras to really put reporters on the ground and to be able to film on the ground really brought sort of the American television screen into the war too, which obviously had an effect on the people living in the United States and the pro-war, anti-war divide. I mean, now, of course, obviously we have partisan politics between Democrats, Republicans, and a lot of people talk about, is the U.S. going to have a civil war again, which I think is ridiculous, but I digress. But the 1960s, it's like, wow, the amount of division was just unreal between pro-war and anti-war camps. Really almost tore the country apart.
America was
whether it's worse now, that's for you to decide.
Changing nation. This became this. This became this. And this became this. The new slogan that was taking root, make love, not war. The majority of Americans did not approve of Johnson's handling of the Vietnam War, and in 1968, a silent majority elected law and order candidate Richard Nixon.
And Richard Nixon, too, he might have actually, Lyndon B. Johnson did not run again in 1968. His vice president, Hubert Humphreys, he ran. And a few days, there was actually a negotiated settlement between North Vietnam and South Vietnam. There was going to be a truce. And the South Vietnamese government actually broke this truce with the North on the advice of Richard Nixon's campaign. This significantly damaged the Democrat campaign, which was Hubert Humphreys, who was the vice president, and might have been one of the reasons why Richard Nixon was actually able to win the 1968 election, because it wasn't a landslide. It was relatively close, not 2000 close, but it was a relatively close campaign. And so this was just, first of many examples of what his nickname being Tricky Dick, of Nixon lying to the American people and abusing sort of his power.
War. And in 1968, a silent majority elected law and order candidate Richard Nixon. As the Vietnam War appeared to be increasingly unwinnable and public opinion turning increasingly sour, Nixon made the decision to begin bringing the troops home and ended U.S. involvement in Vietnam by 1973. 2 years later, the South fell. The Cold War was now taking...
which is really America sort of abandoned its allies and tried to save face. Just it was inevitable that the South would fall. However, the ARVN, the people that fought in the ARVN, the South Vietnamese forces, fought incredibly bravely and did everything that they could.
Its toll on both superpowers.
Though again, it came down to corrupt leadership.
Russia, a huge percentage of the budget was still going to the military. People were still hungry, and they just didn't have access to the same lifestyle and goods as the West. And what did they have to show for it? They weren't even winning the space race anymore. Both sides needed to reduce spending.
I don't know if that was terribly relevant to Soviet civilians
in order to rescue their economies, and so both welcomed with open arms an easing of hostilities, otherwise known as détente. To improve relations, Nixon became the first US president to visit Moscow in 1972, and Brezhnev returned the gesture a year later. A number of treaties were signed, including the 1972 SALT agreement that limited nuclear weapons. Relations with China were even improving via ping-pong diplomacy when the US table tennis team went on a tour of the People's Republic. However, internally, China was still pushing anti-capitalist propaganda, which led to some mixed messages. Nixon even visited China in 1972, and it was a barrel of laughs.
Today, the president walks among priceless treasures from China's golden age. Among them, a pair of ear stoppers used by the emperor to keep from hearing criticism.
You put the stopper into his ears so that he couldn't hear the criticism.
Give me a pair of
Of course he'd say that. Oh, God, Nixon.
Everything was going great for Nixon, until it was uncovered that back home he was being a very naughty boy and violating constitutional protocol. I'm announcing today my resignation as president, and I'm passing the office to my vice president, Gerald Ford.
Yeah, not only that, so Gerald Ford actually wasn't elected vice president. That was Spiro Agnew, I think his name was. But he had to resign due to, shocking, corruption. And Gerald Ford, I think, was the House leader. And the first thing he did after becoming president was, well, not the first thing, but one of the first things he did after becoming president was pardoning Nixon.
Wow, you mean in America that people can actually remove their leader when he breaks the law? Why not just rule by force? Where's the corruption? And my first act as president is to pardon Nixon. There it is.
Too soon.
After the whole fiasco, Americans decided what they really wanted was just a nice, safe guy who wouldn't cheat on them. So they elected Jimmy Carter, and the two sides met in Vienna, where they signed yet another
Jimmy Carter was a
strategic
peanut
arms
farmer
limitation treaty. It's an honor, Premier
Georgia.
Brezhnev. Likewise, President Carter. Please don't do that. But that's not to say there was no longer any tension between the two sides, because there was. Heaps of it. Once again, the Soviet Union put down further attempts at reform and rebellion in the Eastern Bloc. The Euro missile crisis saw new and improved classes of intermediate-range missiles being deployed in Europe. In 1979, the Soviets thought it would be a good idea if they had their own Vietnam and invaded Afghanistan to prevent a US-sponsored Islamic insurgency.
And so, yeah, exactly that. And so the United States, they would go and they would fund the Mujahideen, which Osama bin Laden was a part of. And as we all know, in modern history, this would significantly come around and sort of turn on America in the future.
Good idea if they had their own Vietnam and invaded Afghanistan to prevent a US-sponsored Islamic insurgency. And in response to these various crises, Olympic Games were boycotted. Conservatives were concerned that US policy had become too soft. And in 1980, they decided they wanted a president who would be tough on communism. So they elected Ronald Reagan. And Reagan came in guns blazing. Concerned at the Soviet Union's human rights violations, he made a speech calling them an evil empire. And he also wanted to renew the arms race using technological advances in computing and lasers. He came up with the Space Defense Initiative, also known as Star Wars, which was basically a big defensive anti-nuke shield around the country. But a lot of people thought it was a pretty dumb idea. The Soviet Union perceived this shift in rhetoric as the USA getting ready for war, and they were feeling especially threatened as their relationship with their communist ally China had broken down.
Well, not only actually the Sino-Soviet split had happened in 1960 between Mao and Khrushchev. Sorry if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. And at this point, China and the USSR are not staunch allies as they were before, but more flexible allies. So as noted before, Nixon obviously made his way to China, and China is doing its own things in Southeast Asia now too. They actually invaded Vietnam after the Vietnam War, and it was really mixing in its own affairs at this point in time. So they weren't staunch allies, as I think, because they're the same color on the graph here, but rather they were sort of flexible allies.
Relations took a big hit in 1983 when the Soviets shot down a Korean airliner that had strayed into their airspace, and it looked like the world was going right back to mid-20th century Cold War tension. But then Brezhnev got really old and died, and was replaced by this guy who was really old and died, and was replaced by this guy who was really old and died, and he was replaced by Mikhail Gorbachev.
Fun fact about Gorbachev: Gorbachev was the only leader of the Soviet Union who was born in the Soviet Union. every other leader had been born in the Russian Empire.
Coming into office in 1985, he was the real game changer. His philosophy differed a lot from previous Soviet leaders. He felt that the reason the Soviet system and economy was struggling was that it didn't allow the Soviet people to find satisfaction in their work, because they weren't allowed to speak freely and lived in fear. Gorbachev wanted the Soviet people to be happy, but unlike previous Soviet leaders, he actually made the change happen. Within the first couple of years, he began the political movement for more openness and transparency, and the restructuring of the Soviet political and economic systems. And change very quickly took effect. People could criticize the government, they could enjoy Western pop culture, the media interviewed Margaret Thatcher, but most importantly, the Soviet people could now enjoy Pizza Hut.
Yeah, and there's some fascinating clips online of I think it was the first McDonald's ever in Russia, and there's still a newscast from whatever year that was, and it's really quite a thing to seeing Russian people sort of enjoying the staple of American consumerism, and Pizza Hut and other things like this. But these policies were just huge, right? The most liberalizing policies up to this point was Nikita Khrushchev. I'm going to keep pronouncing that wrong. His liberalization efforts and his de-Stalinization efforts. And so for Mikhail Gorbachev to come in and to liberalize a lot of facets of life in the Soviet Union, this was just massive, unheard of at the time. And although it led to the downfall of the Soviet Union, it was definitely a step in the right direction for the people.
All hail to Gorbachev. He also knew that the arms race needed to end in order to rescue the Soviet economy, and a positive relationship with the West must be established. Constructive dialogue reopened and resulted in the INF Treaty, which saw all intermediate-range missiles eliminated, which was huge.
Amazing.
Reagan's tone towards the Soviet Union began to soften, and things were looking up. But what would these reforms mean for the Eastern Bloc? For decades, the Soviets had been brutally suppressing any attempt at change. Now, would they be allowed? And that was the exact question on Hungary's lips when the Prime Minister visited Moscow. Gorbachev's response: he didn't necessarily agree with the reforms, but he wouldn't stop them either. He was prepared to let the Eastern Bloc choose its own future. This,
and you already know which way they chose,
was massive, and the Hungarian leaders began planning free.
And so one interesting player in the elections of 1989 was a certain Viktor Orban, who is the current Prime Minister of Hungary. I won't get into my personal opinion about him because that's not the point of this video. However, he was a very staunch anti-communist and one of the big pushers. I believe he was a student. He was a student leader at this point, and he was actually one of the big pushers for elections in 1989. And like I said, I won't get into him specifically, but that's just a little interesting fact.
Multi-party elections. Poland followed suit and also held elections in June. The anti-Soviet party Solidarity won 99 out of 100 seats in the Senate. But not just that. In Hungary, the barbed wire border between East and West was removed.
So this was the Pan-European picnic that was actually organized by Otto Habsburg. And this was done to really have an opportunity to open the border between Austria and Hungary, in which a lot of people from the east would flee into Austria. And Otto Habsburg obviously would have been the next prince of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and he lived until relatively recently as well. I think he died in the 2000s, but he was a big advocate for pan-Europeanism, and so kind of cool that what would have been the ruler of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and would have had Hungary as a subject, so to say. I know the Austro-Hungarian Empire is more complicated than that. Played a role in freeing Hungary from the empire of the Soviet Union. Kind of cool.
The Iron Curtain was unraveling, but not all Eastern Bloc leaders were happy. Notably, East Germany was still ruled by a hardline Stalinist, Erich Honecker, and many East Germans were still eager to get out. They had been trapped by the Berlin Wall, but now they were doing the math. If they could travel to Hungary, and Hungary's border with the West was loosening, could they now make it to the West? That summer, East Germans decided Hungary was the latest top holiday destination.
Like how Georgia's the top holiday destination right now for Russians.
They traveled there in droves, and using various methods, tens of thousands crossed the border into Austria and the West. Honecker was furious and blocked travel to Hungary, but that civil liberties train had started rolling, and it was
just don't stop.
Thousands more flocked to the West German embassy in Prague. where they stormed the fence around the embassy gardens and a temporary refugee camp was set up. In September, deals were struck to allow the refugees to travel west via train. Back in East Germany, the people were running on a civil liberties high, and they wanted their next hit. Dissent was growing. Over time, demonstrations turned to mass protest, with plainclothes secret police officers doing their best to put down the dissent, but it had grown well out of their control. And worse, the biggest demonstration was yet to come. We're gonna put all of this down by force. Right, guys?
Nope.
Guys? Unfortunately, everyone had realized what he had not. This was bigger than them, and the entire East German Politburo voted him out of power. On November 4th, over 500,000 East Germans took to the streets of East Berlin. For many, there was still one big target left in their sights. That damn wall. The pressure on the East German government was too great, and on November 9th, they made a bit of a chaotic announcement that the travel ban between East and West was being lifted.
Yeah, and this broadcast still exists on the Tagesschau, and you can find it on YouTube, and it's really, really cool to watch. I think it has English subtitles, community-created English subtitles, but if you're able to watch the original broadcast in German, it's really, really cool. And to see the the Tagesschau is probably the most boring news show in the world, which is the way it should be. But to see this sort of historic events just sort of broadcast as a nightly news type thing, it's a cool little historical artifact that you can watch yourself on YouTube.
The change wasn't meant to take effect until the next day, and crossing guards still had orders to shoot on sight any who tried to cross. But that night, huge crowds gathered at the crossing points, and the guards were overwhelmed. In an astronomically historic moment, after decades of family separation and travel restriction, the people were allowed to pass through.
And I think it's important just to not underestimate how important this is, right? The Soviet Union has been behind an iron curtain for decades now. Right, families were split between East and West, and for it to finally be open, this was unparalleled.
East and West Berliners couldn't believe it and celebrated together throughout the night. Some even climbed the wall and began to topple it. The Iron Curtain had fallen, and a year later, Germany would be reunited. Elections in Bulgaria, a peaceful revolution in Czechoslovakia.
Yeah, the Velvet Revolution was really quite astounding too. This video is getting a little long, so I don't want to get totally into it. But the fact that it was totally peaceful, Czechoslovakia, and eventually the Czech-Slovak split was also done entirely peacefully. And I don't know if this is true, but I've heard that it's one of the only times that a country was split peacefully in Europe. Again, I don't know if that's true, but it wasn't the result of a war. It was just a peaceful Czech-Slovak split.
And a violent one in Romania
which the violent one in Romania killed the Kreshnews. I'm so sorry if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. Though he was a really, really bad dictator in Romania. I won't get too into him, but yeah, that was definitely a violent one, and I think both his wife and him were shot, if I remember correctly.
To an end communist authority in the Eastern Bloc, America decided it would be best if it just stayed away and let the change happen, as the anti-communist movement continued all the way back to Moscow. Gorbachev had given the people the freedom to demonstrate. Now, they demonstrated for an end to the communist single-party rule, and Gorbachev had to give in. For the first time in history, elections were held in which candidates not officially endorsed by the party were allowed to run. Ambitious rival of Gorbachev, Boris Yeltsin, led a growing democratic movement. Now things here get quite confusing, and the dissolution of the Soviet Union is a complicated topic, so believe me, this is oversimplified, but it went a little bit like this. The Soviet Union was made up of a number of smaller Soviet republics, the largest of which was Russia. Yeltsin got himself elected the president of Russia, and began a struggle for sovereignty against Gorbachev and the greater Soviet Union. Communist hardliners were horrified at what Gorbachev was allowing, so they briefly kidnapped him and tried to set up their own emergency government. But Yeltsin and his supporters all gathered around the White House in Moscow and were like, no, we have a tank. So the hardliners had to concede and released Gorbachev. Wow, thanks Boris. That was a close one. No problem. And thanks to you for all the great freedom you've given us. Anytime, pal. And just to inform you, I've used that freedom you've given us to go behind your back and make a deal with Ukraine and Belarus to dissolve the Soviet Union and set up the Russian Federation. In other words, you're no longer in charge. I am. Dude. So uncool. And so decades of tension and the everlasting threat of nuclear war finally came to an end as democratic governments were established in many of the old Soviet republics, and the world got along together forever after. Right, guys?
For about 10 minutes.
Hey, this modern art thing is growing on me.
Yeah, so, great video. Yeah, I think the world was at peace for maybe about 10 minutes. And then something else happened. Anyways, thank you all very much for joining me on this oversimplified journey. Cold War. I liked part 2 more than I liked part 1. I know more about part 2. I know more about the events. I think that I need to read more about the Korean War and sort of the lead up to the Cold War rather than the sort of 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. If you've made it this far in the video, thank you very much. You're a champion. I appreciate you. And I will see you guys in the next one, whatever that will be. Like I said, leave a comment, like, subscribe, all that. Thank you all very much. Bye-bye.